The letter arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 20 years to the day after my mother vanished from my life. I had been 6 years old when she disappeared, young enough to be confused by her absence, but old enough to feel the weight of it, the way it pressed down on our household like a physical force, bending everything and everyone out of shape. My father had told me she was gone, and that was all he ever said about it. Gone. As if she were a bus that had departed on schedule, as if she were a season that had passed, as if she were anything other than the woman who had given birth to me and raised me for the first 6 years of my life. He never spoke of her again, and he made it clear, through his silences and his cold, hard stares, that I was not to speak of her either. My grandparents, who lived 3 hours away and visited only on holidays, followed his lead. My mother's name was erased from our family lexicon, a word that had become taboo, a ghost that haunted the edges of our lives but was never acknowledged. And so I grew up in a house defined by absence. My father was not a warm man, not before my mother left, and certainly not after. He was the kind of man who believed that emotions were a sign of weakness, that children should be seen and not heard, that the best way to prepare a child for the harsh realities of the world was to be harsh yourself. He provided for me materially. I never went hungry. I never lacked for clothes or school supplies or a roof over my head, but he never provided for me emotionally. He never told me he loved me. He never hugged me. He never asked me how I was feeling or what I was thinking or whether I was happy. He was a presence in my life, a large and intimidating presence, but he was not a father, not in any way that mattered. I coped with this absence by constructing a fantasy of my mother. In my imagination, she was beautiful and kind and full of warmth. She had left because she had no choice, because some external force had compelled her to go, because she loved me too much to stay. This fantasy was not based on any evidence. It was based on need, on the desperate, aching need of a child who could not accept that his mother had simply abandoned him. I told myself stories about her, elaborate narratives in which she was a spy or a secret agent or a princess in hiding, someone who had been forced to leave me behind for reasons beyond her control. These stories were ridiculous, and I knew they were ridiculous, but they were all I had. They were the only shield I possessed against the cold, hard reality of my father's silence. As I grew older, the fantasy faded. Adolescence brought with it a cynicism that made it impossible to sustain the elaborate narratives of my childhood. I stopped believing that my mother was a spy or a princess. I started believing, instead, that she was just a woman who had decided she didn't want to be a mother anymore. This belief was, in its own way, even more painful than the fantasy had been comforting. The fantasy had allowed me to imagine that my mother loved me, that she had been forced to leave against her will. The reality, as I understood it, was that she had simply chosen to abandon me, that I had not been enough to make her stay. This belief shaped me in ways I am still trying to understand. It made me guarded, defensive, slow to trust, and quick to assume the worst in people. It made me push away anyone who tried to get close to me, because I had learned, at the age of 6, that the people you loved could disappear without warning. It made me build walls around my heart, high and thick and seemingly impenetrable, walls that protected me from the pain of abandonment but also isolated me from the possibility of love. I had friends, but not close ones. I had relationships, but they never lasted. I had a life, but it was a small life, a cautious life, a life lived in the shadow of the great unanswered question that had defined my existence. Why did my mother leave me? Why wasn't I enough? The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. I was 26 years old, living in a cramped studio apartment in the city, working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm that I didn't care about. The apartment was small and shabby, with a leaking faucet in the kitchen and a radiator that clanked and groaned throughout the night, and a view of a brick wall that I had been staring at for 3 years. I had chosen this apartment because it was cheap, and I had chosen this life because it was safe. I didn't take risks. I didn't pursue dreams. I didn't allow myself to want things too much, because wanting things was a setup for disappointment. My mother had taught me that lesson without ever meaning to. The doorbell rang at 10 in the morning, which was unusual. I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee and staring at my computer screen, trying to summon the motivation to start my work for the day. I opened the door to find a courier standing in the hallway, a young man in a blue uniform holding a thick envelope and an electronic tablet for me to sign. He was young, probably early 20s, with the kind of bland, professional politeness that couriers cultivate to get through their day. "Delivery for Elena Brennan," he said, consulting his tablet. "Sign here, please." I signed, my hand trembling slightly for reasons I didn't fully understand. There was something about the envelope that felt significant, something about its weight and its thickness and the formal, official appearance of the return address. Whitmore and Chase, attorneys at law. An address in a small town called Millbrook, about 2 hours north of the city. I had never heard of Whitmore and Chase. I had never been to Millbrook. I had no reason to receive a letter from a law firm in a town I had never visited. I closed the door and stood in my tiny kitchen, holding the envelope, feeling a strange, inexplicable sense of dread. It was the same feeling I used to get as a child when my father came home late at night, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, his mood dark and unpredictable. It was the feeling of something bad about to happen, something that could not be avoided or escaped. I opened the envelope with a knife from the kitchen drawer, my movements careful and deliberate, as if the paper itself were fragile and might crumble at my touch. Inside was a letter from the law firm, typed on heavy, cream-colored stationery with the firm's letterhead embossed in gold at the top. The letter was brief and formal, the kind of letter that lawyers write when they are carrying out the final wishes of someone long gone. "Dear Ms. Brennan," the letter began. "We are writing to you today on behalf of our client, Margaret Brennan, who passed away 3 months ago. Per her explicit instructions, we have been holding a document in our safekeeping for the past 20 years to be delivered to you on this specific date. That document is enclosed with this letter. We hope that it brings you the answers you have been seeking. Please do not hesitate to contact our office if you have any questions or require any further information. Sincerely, Jonathan Whitmore, Partner, Whitmore and Chase, attorneys at law. Margaret Brennan, my mother. The woman who had vanished from my life 20 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a void that had swallowed my childhood and shaped my entire existence. She was dead. She had been dead for 3 months, and I hadn't known. I hadn't felt it. I had been going about my ordinary life, drinking my ordinary coffee, doing my ordinary work, while my mother was being buried in a town I had never visited by people I had never met. But the letter also said something else. Something that made my heart pound and my hands shake and the world tilt around me. Our client, Margaret Brennan. Per her explicit instructions, she had been their client. She had given them instructions. She had planned this 20 years ago, knowing that one day I would receive this letter. She had not simply vanished into the void. She had been alive all this time, and she had been thinking of me. Clipped to the lawyer's letter was a smaller envelope, yellowed with age, its edges soft and worn as if it had been handled many times over the years. My name was written on the front in handwriting that I didn't recognize, neat and careful, the letters slightly slanted to the right, the ink faded from black to a soft, sepia brown. Elena. Just my name. Nothing else. I carried the envelope to my couch, the same second-hand couch I had bought when I first moved into this apartment, and I sat down heavily, my legs no longer able to support me. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time, afraid to open it, afraid not to. This was the moment I had been waiting for my entire life, the moment when the great unanswered question of my existence would finally be addressed, and I was terrified of what the answer might be. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope and opened it. The paper inside was the same cream-colored stationery as the envelope, several pages folded together, covered in that same neat, careful handwriting. The letter was dated the day before my mother disappeared, the last day anyone had seen her, the last day she had been part of my life. "My dearest Elena," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then 20 years have passed since I last held you in my arms, and you are now a grown woman. I am writing this letter because I don't know if I will ever get the chance to explain myself to you in person. I don't know what the future holds, and I am afraid. I am so afraid, my darling girl, not for myself, but for you. I am afraid of what you will think of me when you learn the truth. I am afraid that you will hate me for leaving you. I am afraid that you have spent your whole life believing that I didn't love you. But I did love you, Elena. I loved you more than I have ever loved anyone or anything. And everything I did, everything I am about to do, is because of that love. I had to stop reading. The words were too much, the emotions too overwhelming. I set the letter down on the coffee table, pressed my hands against my face, and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that tore through my chest and left me gasping for air. I had not cried like this since I was a child, since the day my father told me my mother was gone and was never coming back. I had trained myself not to cry, had built walls so high and so thick that even my own emotions couldn't penetrate them. But those walls were crumbling now, shattered by the words of a woman I had never known and had never stopped missing. When I could breathe again, I picked up the letter and continued reading. I need to tell you a story, my mother wrote, and I need you to read it all the way to the end, even if it makes you angry, even if it makes you hate me, because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know who your mother really was and why she did what she did. The story she told was not the story I had expected. It was not a story of abandonment or indifference or a mother who had simply decided she didn't want to be a mother anymore. It was a story of fear, of sacrifice, of a love so fierce and so desperate that it had driven her to do the unthinkable. She wrote about my father, a man named David Brennan, who had been charming and handsome and utterly, irredeemably dangerous. They had met when she was 22 years old, just out of college with a degree in literature and dreams of becoming a writer. She had been young and idealistic and full of hope for the future, and he had seemed like everything she had ever wanted. He was older than her by almost a decade, established in his career, confident and charismatic and possessed of a magnetism that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He courted her with flowers and poetry and grand romantic gestures, made her feel like she was the most important person in the world, promised her a future that was full of love and happiness and everything she had ever dreamed of. She fell in love with him, or at least with the version of him that he presented to her. It was only after they were married, after she was legally bound to him and had begun to build a life around their relationship, that she started to see the truth. The charm was a mask. The charisma was a weapon. The grand romantic gestures were a form of control, a way of making her feel indebted to him, a way of keeping her tethered to a man who was slowly, methodically, isolating her from everyone and everything she had ever cared about. It started small. A comment here, a criticism there. He didn't like her friends, he said. They were a bad influence. He didn't like her family, he said. They didn't respect him. He didn't like her job, her clothes, her hobbies, her opinions. Slowly, piece by piece, he dismantled the life she had built for herself and replaced it with a life that revolved entirely around him. She stopped seeing her friends because it was easier than fighting about it. She stopped talking to her family because he convinced her they didn't really care about her. She stopped writing because he told her she wasn't good enough, that her work was amateurish and embarrassing, that she should focus on more practical things. And then the violence started. It was not dramatic, not at first. A grip on her arm that was just a little too tight. A shove during an argument that sent her stumbling into a wall. A slap across the face that he immediately apologized for, swore would never happen again, blamed on the stress of his job and the pressure he was under. She believed him because she wanted to believe him, because the alternative, the truth, was too terrible to accept. The man she loved, the man she had married, the father of her child, was an abuser, and she was trapped. For 6 years, I lived in fear, my mother wrote, her handwriting becoming shakier, more agitated, as she recounted this part of the story. Fear of your father. Fear of what he would do to me, to you, to anyone who tried to help us. I tried to leave him twice. The first time, I packed a bag and took you to a shelter. He found us within 3 days. He apologized. He cried. He swore he would change. And I went back to him because I didn't know what else to do, because I had no money and no support system and no belief in my own ability to survive on my own. The second time, I called the police. They came to the house, took a report, and left. That night, he broke my arm. He told me that if I ever tried to leave him again, he would kill me. And he told me that if I ever tried to take you away from him, he would kill you too. I closed my eyes, the words blurring before me. My father, the man who had raised me, the man I had loved despite his coldness and his silences and the anger that always seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. He had been an abuser. He had broken my mother's arm. He had threatened to kill her, to kill me. And I had never known. I had lived with this man for 18 years, had eaten at his table and slept under his roof and called him Dad. And I had never known what he was. I know this is hard to read. My mother continued, as if she could sense my anguish across the 20 years that separated us. I know it is painful to learn these things about your father. But you need to understand, Elena. You need to understand why I did what I did. I didn't leave you because I wanted to. I left you because I had to. Because staying would have put you in danger. Because the only way to keep you safe was to make myself the target of his rage instead. The plan, when it came, was born of desperation and hope in equal measure. My mother found an ally, a woman named Sarah who worked at a shelter for victims of domestic violence. Sarah had seen cases like my mother's before, had witnessed the cycle of abuse and reconciliation and escalating violence that trapped women in relationships that were slowly killing them. She helped my mother develop a strategy, a way to escape that would keep both of us safe. It involved fake documents, a new identity, a new life in a place where my father would never find us. But for it to work, my mother would have to leave me behind. Just temporarily, she wrote. Just until she could establish herself in the new location and come back for me. I left you with your grandparents, she wrote, because I knew they would take care of you. I knew they loved you, even if they didn't understand what I was doing or why. I told them I needed time to get myself together, to find a job, to find a place for us to live. I didn't tell them the truth about your father. I was too ashamed. I was too scared. I thought if they knew what he had done to me, they would blame me for staying with him. They would say I was weak, that I should have left sooner, that I had brought this on myself. And so I lied to them, just as I lied to everyone. I told them I was going on a trip, a vacation, a chance to clear my head. I told them I would be back in a few months. And I promised myself, I promised you, that I would come back for you, that I would find a way to make things right. The plan was supposed to take 6 months. My mother would travel to a city on the other side of the country, establish herself under a new identity, find a job and an apartment, and then send for me. We would start over together, a new life in a new place, far away from the man who had terrorized us both. She had saved money in secret, small amounts hidden away where my father wouldn't find them. She had obtained a set of fake identification documents through Sarah's contacts. She had made arrangements for a place to stay, a room in a boarding house in a town she had chosen because it was small and quiet and far away from everything she had ever known. But something went wrong. My father found out about the plan. To this day, my mother wrote, she didn't know how. Maybe someone told him. Maybe he was watching her more closely than she realized. Maybe he had found the money or the documents or the notes she had been keeping, the careful records of her escape that she had hidden in a place she thought was safe. Whatever the source, the result was the same. The night before she was supposed to leave, my father came home with a look in his eyes that she had never seen before. A look of pure, unadulterated rage. He told me that he knew everything, she wrote. He told me that he knew about the money, about the documents, about the arrangements I had made. He told me that he knew about Sarah, and that if she ever contacted me again, he would make sure she regretted it for the rest of her life. And then he told me something that I have never forgotten, not for a single day in the 20 years since. He told me that if I ever tried to take you away from him, he would kill us both. He would rather see us dead, he said, than see us free. And I believed him. I knew, in that moment, with a certainty that went all the way down to my bones, that he was capable of it, that he would do it without hesitation, that he loved his pride more than he loved either of us. So my mother made a choice. The hardest choice of her life, she wrote. The choice that would define the rest of her existence. She would leave, as planned, but she would leave me behind. Not temporarily, as she had hoped, Not for 6 months, as she had promised herself. Permanently. She would disappear completely, vanish without a trace, make herself impossible to find. And in doing so, she would protect me. If my father believed she was gone forever, if he believed she had abandoned us both and was never coming back, he would have no reason to hurt me. I would be safe. She would be the sacrifice. I knew that if I stayed, he would kill us both eventually, she wrote. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually. The violence was escalating. The threats were becoming more specific, more detailed, more impossible to ignore. I could see the future stretching out ahead of me, and it was a future that ended in blood. And I knew that if I tried to take you with me, he would hunt us down. He had the resources. He had the connections. He had the obsessive, possessive determination of a man who viewed his wife and child as property, and he would never, ever let us go. And so I chose to save you the only way I could. I chose to leave you behind, to let you grow up without me, to let you believe, if necessary, that I didn't love you. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, Elena. Walking away from you, knowing that I might never see you again, knowing that you would grow up wondering why your mother abandoned you. I have cried every single day for 20 years. I have missed you with an ache that never goes away, a physical pain that sits in my chest and reminds me, every moment, of what I lost. I have loved you from a distance, watching from afar, never able to reach out, never able to explain. I have attended your school plays in disguise, sitting in the back row with a hat pulled low over my face, my heart bursting with pride and shattering with sorrow at the same time. I have followed your career, read about your achievements in the local newspaper, celebrated your successes from a distance. I have watched you grow up, Elena, and I have been so proud of the woman you have become. But I have never been able to tell you. I have never been able to hold you or comfort you or share in your joys and your sorrows. I have been a ghost in your life, present but invisible, loving you but unable to show it. I read those words through tears that fell so fast and so thick that I could barely see the page. She had been there. All those years, she had been there. She had come to my school plays, my graduation, the milestones of my life that I had thought were witnessed only by my father's cold, disapproving stare. She had been watching, loving me, aching for me, unable to reach out. And I had never known. I had spent my entire life believing I was unloved, unwanted, abandoned. And all the while, my mother was there, a silent guardian, a secret witness, a love that dared not speak its name. And now, 20 years later, your father is dead, the letter continued. He died 3 months ago, of a heart attack. I read about it in the newspaper. I have been reading the newspaper every day for 20 years, searching for any sign that it might be safe to come home. And now, at last, it is safe. The threat that kept me away is gone. The man who terrorized us both is no longer a danger to anyone. I don't know if you will want to see me, the letter concluded. I don't know if you can ever forgive me for what I did. I don't know if the 20 years of silence between us can ever be bridged. But I am here, Elena. I have been here all along, waiting for the day when it would be safe to come back to you. I am living in a small town called Millbrook, about 2 hours north of the city. I work at the public library, shelving books and helping people find the stories they're looking for. It's a quiet life, a simple life, but it's mine. And if you ever want to meet me, if you ever want to hear the rest of the story, if you ever want to try to rebuild what we lost, I will be here. I will always be here, waiting, hoping, loving you. Forever, your mother, Margaret. I sat on my couch, the letter in my hands, the tears streaming down my face, and I felt the world rearrange itself around me. The story I had told myself for 20 years, the story of a mother who had abandoned me because I wasn't enough, was a lie. Not a comforting lie, not a protective lie, but a lie nonetheless. My mother had not abandoned me. She had sacrificed herself for me. She had given up everything, her entire life, to keep me safe from a man who would have killed us both. And she had spent 20 years watching me from a distance, loving me from a distance, waiting for the day when she could finally explain. The anger I had carried for so long, the anger at a woman I had never known, was suddenly gone. In its place was something else. something that felt almost like grief, but also like hope. My mother was alive. She was waiting for me. She wanted to see me. I stood up, still clutching the letter, and I looked around my tiny apartment. The water-stained ceiling, the clanking radiator, the view of a brick wall. It was not much of a life, but it was mine, and it had been shaped, in ways I was only beginning to understand, by the absence of the woman who had written this letter. I didn't know if I could forgive her. I didn't know if the 20 years of silence could ever be fully bridged. But I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I wanted to try. I wanted to meet her. I wanted to hear the rest of the story. I wanted to see, for the first time in 20 years, my mother's face. The drive to Millbrook took 2 hours, winding through the countryside on roads that grew narrower and more rural with every mile. The city faded behind me, the crowded streets and towering buildings giving way to suburbs, and then to farmland, and then to the rolling, forested hills of the countryside. It was a beautiful drive, the kind of drive that would have been relaxing under any other circumstances. But my mind was too full of questions to relax. What would she look like? What would I say to her? How do you introduce yourself to a mother you haven't seen in 20 years? Millbrook was exactly the kind of town I had imagined when I read my mother's letter. Small and picturesque, the kind of place that belonged on a postcard or in a Norman Rockwell painting. The main street was lined with brick buildings and antique shops and family-owned restaurants with names like Millbrook Diner and Corner Bakery. There was a single traffic light at the main intersection, blinking yellow in the afternoon sun. There was a park with a gazebo and a playground and an old oak tree that looked like it had been there for centuries. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where strangers were noticed and remembered, where life moved at a slower, gentler pace. The public library was easy to find. It was a charming old building with a clock tower and a wraparound porch and a sign that read, Millbrook Public Library, established 1902. It looked like something out of a storybook, the kind of place where magical things might happen, where a lonely child might discover a hidden world between the pages of a book. I parked my car at the curb and sat there for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for my entire life without knowing it. The moment when I would finally meet my mother. Part of me wanted to start the car and drive away, to retreat back to my safe, predictable life and pretend this day had never happened. But I knew I couldn't. I had come this far. I had read the letter. I had learned the truth. And now I had to see it through to the end. The library was quiet and cool, the air heavy with the smell of old books and floor polish and the particular stillness that libraries cultivate. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. The floors were hardwood, polished to a warm gleam by decades of footsteps. The shelves were tall and crowded, filled with books of every size and color and description. It was the kind of place that felt sacred, a temple to the written word, a sanctuary for anyone who loved stories. There was a woman behind the circulation desk, her back to me, shelving a card of returned books. She was small and slender, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she moved with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had spent a lifetime handling fragile things. She was humming softly to herself, a melody I didn't recognize, but that stirred something deep in my memory. A lullaby, perhaps. The same lullaby I had heard in my dreams, the one that had haunted the edges of my consciousness for 20 years. I walked up to the desk, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, and she turned around. Her face was older than I had imagined, lined with wrinkles and marked by the passage of time. But her eyes were my eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same expression of cautious hope. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. We just stood there, mother and daughter, separated by 20 years of silence and distance and longing. Elena, she whispered finally, and her voice broke on my name. It was the voice from my dreams, the voice that sang the lullaby, the voice that had been missing from my life for as long as I could remember. Mom, I said, and it was the first time I had spoken that word in 20 years. It felt strange on my tongue, unfamiliar and yet completely natural, like a language I had known as a child and was only now remembering. She came around the desk, her movements slow and hesitant, as if she were afraid I might disappear if she moved too quickly. She stopped a few feet away from me, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't know if you would come," she said. "I've been waiting for 20 years. I've imagined this moment 1,000 times, but I never really believed it would happen. I never really believed you would want to see me after everything I did." "I almost didn't come," I admitted, my voice rough with emotion. "I was scared. I've been scared my whole life. Scared of being abandoned again. Scared of finding out that you didn't really love me. Scared of learning that I wasn't enough." I paused, swallowing hard. "But I read your letter. I read every word. And I understand now. I understand why you left. I understand what you sacrificed for me. And I'm not scared anymore." She let out a sob, a small, broken sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, and she took another step toward me. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for everything. I wanted to be there for you. I wanted to watch you grow up. I wanted to be your mother, in every sense of the word. But I couldn't. I couldn't risk your safety. I couldn't let him hurt you. Every day, for 20 years, I have thought about you. Every night, I have dreamed about you. I have loved you from the moment you were born, and I have never stopped. Not for a single second." "I know," I said, and I reached out and took her hand. It was small and warm and trembling, and it felt like coming home. "I know, Mom. It's okay. We're going to be okay." She pulled me into her arms, and I let her. I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her, lavender and old books, and something else, something that was just her. She held me tightly, as if she were afraid I might vanish if she let go, and I held her just as tightly. We stood there in the quiet library, surrounded by books and dust motes and the weight of 20 years, and we wept. Not tears of sadness, or at least not only tears of sadness. Tears of relief. Tears of reunion. Tears of a wound that was finally, after 2 decades, beginning to heal. The librarian, a kind-faced woman with glasses and a cardigan, appeared from somewhere among the stacks. She took one look at us, at the tears streaming down our faces and the way we were clinging to each other, and she smiled. "Margaret," she said softly, "is this your daughter?" My mother pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said, her voice full of wonder. "This is my Elena. She came home." The librarian nodded, her smile widening. "I'll take over the desk for a while. You two go sit down. You have a lot to talk about." My mother led me to a quiet corner of the library, a small reading nook with 2 overstuffed armchairs and a window that looked out onto a garden. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other, taking in the details of faces that were both familiar and strange. She had my eyes, my nose, the same curve of the jaw. I had her hands, long-fingered and graceful, the hands of a woman who had spent her life with books. "I have so many questions," I said finally. "I don't even know where to start." "Start anywhere," she said. "Start at the beginning, or the middle, or the end. I'll answer whatever you ask. I've been waiting 20 years to tell you everything." And so we talked. We talked for hours, until the sun went down and the library closed, and the kind-faced librarian gently told us we would have to continue our conversation elsewhere. My mother took me to her house, a small cottage on the edge of town with a garden full of flowers and a bookshelf full of books and a framed photograph of me on the mantelpiece. The photograph was old, taken when I was 5 years old, the year before she left. I was sitting on a swing in a park, my face split in a gap-toothed grin, my hair blowing in the wind. She had kept it all these years. She had looked at it every single day. We talked through the evening and into the night. She told me about the years after she left, the terror and the loneliness and the constant, gnawing fear that my father would find her. She told me about the jobs she had worked, waitressing and cleaning houses and doing whatever she could to survive. She told me about the friends she had made, the people who had helped her rebuild a life from the wreckage of the one she had lost. And she told me about the letters she had written to me, dozens of them, letters she had never sent because she didn't know where to send them, because she was afraid they would be intercepted, because she didn't know if I would want to read them. She gave me those letters, a box full of them, each one dated and sealed in its own envelope. I took them home with me that night, and over the following weeks, I read every single one. They were a chronicle of her love for me, a love that had endured despite everything, a love that had never wavered or diminished. She wrote about the day I was born, the way I had looked up at her with eyes that were already curious and alert. She wrote about the day she left, the agony of walking away, the way she had sat in her car and sobbed for hours before she could bring herself to drive. She wrote about every birthday, every holiday, every milestone she had missed, and the way she had marked those occasions in her own private way. A candle lit in a darkened room. A prayer whispered into the silence. A hope that somewhere, somehow, I was happy. And I told her about my life. About my father, the man who had raised me, the man I had loved without knowing what he was. About the coldness and the silences and the anger that had defined my childhood. About the years I had spent wondering why my mother had left me, why I wasn't good enough for her to stay. About the slow, painful process of understanding that none of it had been my fault, that I had been loved all along, more than I had ever known. We cried together many times. We laughed together too, discovering the shared quirks and mannerisms that proved we were mother and daughter despite everything. We both hated cilantro. We both loved old movies and rainy days and the smell of freshly baked bread. We both had a habit of humming under our breath when we were nervous, a habit I had never understood until I heard her doing it and recognized the tune. The lullaby, the one from my dreams. The past could not be undone. The 20 years we had lost could never be recovered. But the future was still ahead of us, vast and full of possibility. And we were determined to make the most of every moment we had left. In the months that followed, I made the drive to Millbrook every weekend. I got to know the town, the people, the rhythms of my mother's quiet life. I met her friends, the librarian who had given us privacy on that first day, the neighbors who had known her for years but never knew she had a daughter. I helped her in the garden, learned the names of the flowers she had planted, the roses and the peonies and the lavender that reminded her of her own mother. And I learned, slowly and painfully, to let go of the anger I had carried for so long. The anger at my father, the anger at the world, the anger at myself for not being enough. It didn't disappear overnight. It was a process, a long and difficult process, but with every visit, every conversation, every shared moment, the anger faded, and in its place grew something I had never expected to feel. Peace, acceptance, a quiet, steady love that filled the spaces where the anger used to live. We developed routines, the small, precious rituals that define a relationship. Every Saturday morning, I would arrive at her cottage just as the sun was rising over the hills. She would have coffee ready, brewed the way she had always made it, strong and dark with a pinch of cinnamon that she said her own mother had taught her to add. We would sit on her back porch, overlooking the garden she had planted and tended for 15 years, and we would talk. Sometimes about big things, the past and the pain and the slow process of healing. Sometimes about small things, the weather and the news and the books we were reading. And sometimes we would just sit in silence, comfortable and companionable, watching the birds flit among the flowers and the sun climb higher in the sky. She told me more about her life in Millbrook, filling in the details of the years I had missed. She had arrived here with nothing but a single suitcase and a heart full of fear. The first few months had been the hardest. She had rented a room in a boarding house, worked 3 jobs to save enough money for an apartment of her own. She had been terrified constantly, jumping at shadows, convinced that every stranger was my father come to find her. But slowly, as the months turned into years and no one came, the fear had begun to fade. She had made friends. She had found a job at the library. She had built a life, small and quiet but hers, and she had held on to it with a fierce, protective love. I was happy here, she told me one morning, her voice soft and reflective. Not completely happy. There was always a part of me that was missing, the part that belonged to you. But I found a kind of peace. I found a way to keep going, even when keeping going felt impossible. The library saved me, I think. The books, the people, the daily rhythm of shelving and cataloging and helping patrons find what they were looking for. It gave me a purpose. It gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. She introduced me to her colleagues at the library, the women and men who had become her second family over the years. There was Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, a woman in her 70s with a sharp wit and a kind heart who had hired my mother when no one else would. There was David, the young assistant who worked the weekend shift and who always had a new joke to share. There was Maria, who ran the children's reading program and who had been trying for years to convince my mother to read aloud to the kids during story time. My mother had always refused, too shy, too self-conscious. But now, with me by her side, she was beginning to find the courage to try new things. "She's been like a new person since you came back," Mrs. Patterson told me one afternoon, her eyes twinkling behind her thick glasses. "She smiles more. She laughs more. She talks about you constantly, you know? Every patron who comes in here has heard about her daughter Elena, the one who's a graphic designer in the city, the one who's so talented and so smart and so beautiful. She's so proud of you, dear. She always has been." The words brought tears to my eyes. I had spent so many years believing I was a disappointment, a burden, a child who had been abandoned because she wasn't worth staying for. And all the while, my mother had been proud of me. She had been telling people about me, bragging about my accomplishments, loving me from a distance in the only way she could. One weekend, about 3 months after our reunion, my mother gave me a gift. It was a scrapbook, thick and heavy, its pages filled with photographs and newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. She had been keeping it for 20 years, she explained, adding to it whenever she found something new. Whenever a photograph of me appeared in the local paper, an honor roll listing, a sports team photo, a graduation announcement, she had clipped it out and pasted it into the scrapbook. Whenever she learned something about my life, a new job, a new apartment, a new achievement, she had written it down in her careful, precise handwriting. The scrapbook was a chronicle of my life, seen through her eyes, preserved with love and devotion. "I couldn't be there for you," she said, her voice trembling. "But I wanted you to know that I was watching. I wanted you to know that I cared. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment of your life, I was celebrating from afar. This scrapbook is proof of that. It's proof that you were never forgotten. You were never unloved. You were always, always in my heart." I paged through the scrapbook slowly, reverently, my tears falling onto the plastic covers that protected the fragile clippings. There I was at 7 years old, a gap-toothed second grader with a backpack too big for my small frame. There I was at 12, standing awkwardly in front of a science fair project, a volcano made of papier-mâché. There I was at 16, my hair in a style I now cringe to remember, my smile bright and hopeful. There I was at 18, in my cap and gown, graduating from high school. My mother had been at that graduation, sitting in the back of the auditorium, her heart breaking with pride and sorrow. I had not known. I had not felt her presence. But she had been there. "I remember that day," I said quietly, pointing to the graduation photograph. I remember looking out at the audience and feeling empty. Everyone else had parents cheering for them, families taking pictures. I had my father, but he just sat there with his arms crossed, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. I remember thinking that it would have been different if you were there, that you would have been proud of me. "I was there," my mother whispered. "I was in the back row, near the exit. I wore a hat and sunglasses so no one would recognize me. I watched you walk across that stage, and I was so proud I thought my heart would burst. But I couldn't come up to you afterward. I couldn't tell you. I had to just slip away like I always did, like a ghost." Letters from my birthdays, my graduations, my first day of high school, my first job. Letters full of advice and encouragement and the desperate, aching love of a mother who could not be with her child. I read them all, one by one, each one a gift, each one a window into a heart that had been breaking for 20 years. In one of the letters, written on my 16th birthday, she had written, "I wonder what you look like now. I wonder if you still have the gap between your front teeth, the one I used to tease you about. I wonder if you still love peanut butter and banana sandwiches, the way you did when you were little. I wonder if you still hum to yourself when you're concentrating, the way you used to do when you were coloring. I wonder if you ever think about me. I wonder if you hate me. I hope you don't hate me. I hope, someday, you will understand. I didn't hate her. I had never hated her. I had been angry, yes. Confused. Hurt in ways that were too deep for words. But I had never hated her. And now, holding this scrapbook in my hands, reading her letters and seeing the evidence of her love spread out before me, I felt the last remnants of that anger dissolve completely. She had done what she had to do. She had made an impossible choice, and she had sacrificed her own happiness to protect mine. I could not fault her for that. I could only be grateful. As the months turned into a year, and then 2 years, my mother and I continued to rebuild our relationship. She came to the city to visit me, staying in my tiny apartment and marveling at the sights and sounds of urban life. I took her to my favorite restaurants, my favorite parks, the art museum where I sometimes went on weekends to sketch. She was like a child discovering a new world, her eyes wide with wonder, her enthusiasm infectious. She had spent so many years in her small, quiet town, living a small, quiet life, that the vibrancy of the city was almost overwhelming to her. But she loved it. She loved every moment of it. I introduced her to my friends, the small circle of people I had allowed into my life despite my walls and my defenses. They welcomed her with open arms, charmed by her gentleness and her warmth and the obvious, overwhelming love she had for me. My best friend Chloe, who had listened to me vent about my abandonment issues for years, pulled me aside after meeting my mother for the first time. "She's not what I expected," Chloe said. "She's not the monster you made her out to be. She's just a woman who loves her daughter." "I know," I said. "I'm starting to see that now." My mother also began to heal in ways I hadn't anticipated. The fear that had defined her life for so long, the constant looking over her shoulder, the nightmares that had haunted her sleep, began to fade. She started attending a support group for survivors of domestic violence, meeting with other women who had been through similar experiences. She told me that hearing their stories, sharing her own, had been one of the most powerful experiences of her life. She was not alone. She had never been alone. There were so many women who had suffered as she had suffered, who had made the same impossible choices, who had lived with the same guilt and the same regret. And together, they were healing. One evening, about 18 months after our reunion, my mother told me something that took my breath away. "I want to write a book," she said, her voice hesitant, as if she were afraid I would laugh at her. "About my life. About your father. About everything that happened. I've been thinking about it for years, but I never had the courage to actually do it. But now, with you back in my life, I feel like I finally have a reason to try. I want to tell my story. I want other women to know that they're not alone. I want to honor the sacrifices I made, and the sacrifices you made, and the love that kept us both alive." I took her hand, my eyes filling with tears. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said. "You've always been a writer, Mom. It's what you wanted to do before everything happened. It's what you were meant to be, and I think your story deserves to be told." She started writing the next day. Every morning, she would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notebook, and she would write. She wrote about her childhood, her dreams, her meeting with my father. She wrote about the slow, insidious creep of his control, the way he had dismantled her life piece by piece. She wrote about the violence, the fear, the desperate, all-consuming love she felt for me. She wrote about the plan, the escape, the 20 years of hiding and watching and waiting. She wrote with a clarity and a power that amazed me, as if the words had been building up inside her for 2 decades and were now pouring out in a flood. It took her almost 2 years to finish the manuscript. When she did, she handed it to me with trembling hands, her eyes full of fear and hope in equal measure. "Will you read it?" she asked. "Will you tell me if it's any good?" I read the entire manuscript in a single weekend, unable to put it down. It was beautiful, heartbreaking and powerful, and ultimately hopeful. It was the story of a woman who had been broken but had refused to stay broken. It was the story of a mother's love, fierce and unyielding, that had survived distance and time and the darkest of circumstances. It was the story of my mother, and it was the story of us. It's incredible, I told her, my voice thick with emotion. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever read. You have to publish this, Mom. The world needs to read this story. She did publish it. With the help of a small independent press that specialized in memoirs, her book was released to the world. It received critical acclaim, was featured in newspapers and magazines, and on morning talk shows. My mother, the woman who had spent 20 years hiding in the shadows, was suddenly in the spotlight. She gave interviews, spoke at bookstores and libraries, connected with readers who had been through similar experiences. She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, using her platform to raise awareness and support for women who were still trapped in the situations she had escaped. And through it all, she never stopped being my mother. She came to my apartment for dinner every Sunday, just as she had since our reunion. She called me every evening, just to hear my voice and tell me she loved me. She was there for me in ways she hadn't been able to be when I was a child, and I was there for her in ways I hadn't known I was capable of. On the 10th anniversary of our reunion, I gave my mother a gift. It was a leather-bound journal, similar to the one she had used to write her letters. For your next book, I said, because I know there are more stories inside you, and I want to read every single one. She took the journal, her eyes filling with tears, and she held it against her heart. Thank you, she whispered, for giving me a second chance, for letting me be your mother again, for everything. Thank you, I replied, my voice equally quiet, for never giving up on me, even when I didn't know you were there. The 20 years of silence between us were over. The story that had begun with a letter delivered on a Tuesday morning exactly 20 years after my mother vanished from my life was still being written. It was a story of love and sacrifice and the unbreakable bond between a mother and a daughter. It was a story of healing and hope and the incredible resilience of the human heart. It was our story, and it was not over yet.